In the study of economics, there are a few big assumptions that are made. Ceteris paribus is a term thrown around a lot, and this translated from Latin means all other things being equal. Economists use this term to say that the impact of this thing happening will be that thing happening if everything else stays the same. Now, this is a big assumption for something as complex and interdependent as an economy. But in the same way that a scientist will try their best to control all variables in an experiment, a good economist will make sure to tack this little Latin phrase onto the end of any theory that they are proposing. Another big and equally important assumption is that all participants in an economy, that is you or I, will act in a perfectly rational manner, always buying the most competitive option that is available to us, always working in the most efficient way, always voting for the politicians that support our best interest, and always having access to all of the information that we need to make these wise decisions. Now, as an economist myself, it is hard to pull away from the safety of these assumptions, and I must stress that I am not politically advocating one way or the other. I am not a political scientist, and I prefer not to even discuss the circus that is politics. But with these assumptions and the problems we have experienced in the previous video about trickle-down economics, we have to ask why. Why is this still being promoted? Now it is probably a good time to shamelessly plug the first video in this series to get an insight into the policies we will be discussing here. So feel free to check that out. Or if you're already up to speed with what trickle-down economics is and what its limitations are, feel free to keep watching. Given that the drawbacks of trickle-down economics in the real world massively outweigh the advantages, it would be logical to conclude that most citizens, let alone politicians and their educated advisors, would no longer support economic policies with these characteristics. However, support is still shown for these policies the world over for the following reasons. Trickle-down economics and the policies that make it up are actually very easy to sell to otherwise uninformed voting citizens. The promise of lower taxes and stopping people living off welfare from those taxes resonates well with working class households that aren't going to look into the issue far beyond their annual tax return.
The more than 30 million Americans who have small businesses will see, listen to this, a 40% cut in their marginal tax rate.
Quotes like this sound great to the average voter, and it is easy to get behind because, who likes paying their taxes? Similarly, these policies resonate easily with the ideologies of certain political parties, normally those on the right. The story of small business owners or hard workers pulling themselves up by their bootstraps in a free economic system sounds great to hard-working voters who believe in an honest day's work to put food on the table. And in fairness, a lot of these voters have never needed government subsidies, government welfare, and use very few public goods. And so it's actually in their best short-term interest to vote for politicians pushing a trickle-down system. However, a vast majority would still be disenfranchised by such a system, and ironically, the areas that stand to lose the most under this system tend to vote for it in the highest numbers. Unfortunately, political ideologies are now at a point where individuals will vote for a party that supports these policies regardless of if it's in their own best interests, either out of ignorance, party loyalty, or both. Now, all of this is to say that our economic assumptions have been broken. Either people are willfully choosing to vote against what is best for them, breaking the best interest assumption, or they do not fully comprehend the outcomes of these policies, breaking the perfect access to information assumption. So already, this is not looking good for the foundation of most economic theories. But let's look at another reason why people may support a trickle-down economic system. It must be recognised that some people will actually vote in their best interest for this. Wealthy families that make up high-income electoral districts will be inclined to vote for policymakers that are pushing for lower taxes and looser regulations on the businesses that they own or have invested in. A trickle-down system will actually be good for these people because it will mean more money for them at the end of the day. And this is actually perfectly acceptable, and it is the foundation of a good democracy. So long as everybody understands the policies and votes on issues in a way that is best for them, this is a positive outcome, and it does not violate any of our economic assumptions. The caveat to this would be that these individuals make up a very small proportion of the population and should not be able to have a majority representation in a balanced democracy. So we are still left wondering how these policies get the traction that they do. Lobbying and monetary contributions towards political campaigns is the big reason that trickle-down economics is still around today, despite it being a widely discredited policy. Trickle-down economics may have started out as a policy that meant well for everyone, but it has been shown to really only benefit those that already have a lot of wealth and power. Coincidentally, businesses and individuals with a lot of wealth and power are able to more effectively influence policy through political lobbying as special interest groups. In this case, these are specially interested in making sure that their wealthy members get to make and keep as much money as possible. Political campaigns are becoming very expensive the world over, and most countries have a system for giving money to political parties or candidates to use for these campaigns. Now, normal working class households can't make these donations on the scale that special interest lobbying groups can. These groups are more often than not backed by corporations or extremely wealthy individuals who stand to benefit from a trickle-down system. This walks a legal tightrope. These campaign contributions in almost every country are not supposed to influence the politics of the people receiving them, but in reality, it normally does, in two main ways. The first and most straightforward and most legal way is that groups will just donate to candidates that are already pushing policies like lower taxes and less government business restrictions. Politicians are far more likely to get voted into office if they can run expensive advertising and touring campaigns while their opponents cannot. This in turn makes politicians that would not otherwise push these kinds of policies consider doing it just so that they can get their share of campaign contributions and stand a chance of getting elected. The second way this works is the more sinister side of lobbying, where special interest groups will use the threat of defunding campaigns or funding political rivals to keep politicians in line with their corporate interests rather than the interests of the public. This strategy is devastatingly effective and has been seen used to great effect the world over. For example, in the years prior to the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, the banking lobby donated billions of dollars to political campaigns, resulting in the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act. This was a list of rules and regulations on the banking industries set after the economic depression of 1929. Removing these long-held business restrictions was decidedly a trickle-down-esque political move that probably would not have been considered without this relentless political lobbying. Similarly, special interest groups that are specifically against high taxes, such as Americans for Fair Taxation, Americans for Tax Reform, and Citizens for Tax Justice, were key contributors to federal and state electoral candidates that were promising lower business taxes and lower sales taxes, resulting in policies such as the Republican tax reform of 2018. All of these examples show that special interest groups don't necessarily push trickle-down economics as a whole package, but groups with the wealth and influence to engage in political lobbying will normally benefit from the components of trickle-down economics, be it lower taxes, lower regulation, or privatisation, and so that is what they tend to push with their lobbying. Going back to our economic assumptions, we can actually see that politicians are making good, logical decisions in their own self-interest. Re-election. Even if they are unfortunately making those decisions at the expense of good long-term policy. And so there we have it. In the real world, we often find that our perfect little economic assumptions don't stand up in reality. And this is how misinformation, careful manipulation, and alternative interests can push fundamentally flawed economic theories as respectable alternatives to good economic policies.